And we will talk with the authors of the Left Behind books, the Rapture guys, about what they really mean, or at least what some people really mean, when Obama is called a socialist. It will blow your mind. First, though, the biggest news of the day, biggest news of the year, certainly the biggest news of the war.
Under tough circumstances, the men and women of the United States military have served with honor and succeeded beyond any expectation. Today, I've come to speak to you about how the war in Iraq will end.
On the 18-year anniversary of the day that George W. Bush's father announced that Iraq's army was defeated in the first Iraq War, President Barack Obama today announced that he will end the second Iraq War, which was started by the second President Bush.
So let me say this as plainly as I can. By August 31st, 2010, our combat mission in Iraq will end. As we
That at first tentative and then enthusiastic applause from the serious as it gets Marines of Camp Lejeune put an exclamation point today on the president's history-making speech. This was the antidote to the mission-accomplished presidential aircraft carrier photo op. Rather than a cocky and then embarrassing and then ultimately hideously shameful declaration that the war our troops were still fighting was over, mission accomplished. Today, the new American president explained, and apparently fairly watertight, no wiggle room details, how the American military will extricate itself from Iraq and end the war.
And I've chosen a timeline that will remove our combat brigades over the next 18 months.
After 18 months, 35 to 50,000 American troops will remain in Iraq as a transitional force, not a residual force, but a transitional force, in case you are interested in the semantics. Even with combat brigades gone then, there's no such thing as an American soldier or airman or sailor or Marine who is not combat ready. And it may well be that what those 30 or 50,000 Americans keep doing in Iraq after 18 months still looks a lot like combat. There will be debate and oversight and consternation about what U.S. troops are still doing in Iraq after next August and how many of them ought to be there. That debate, in fact, has already started. A lot of it happened this week on this show. But what we know now is when we're leaving. Totally, completely, fully, residually, or transitionally, or anything-ally leaving. We now have an actual end date.
Under the status of forces agreement with the Iraqi government, I intend to remove all U.S. troops from Iraq by the end of 2011.
It is all over, everyone out by a very long time from now. It's not the end of this year, it's not the end of next year, it is the year after that at the latest. That's the end point. You know, something like 1.7 million Americans have already served in Iraq and Afghanistan. Even if we know the numbers serving in Iraq now will be brought down over time, a lot more are going to serve there still, and for a long time yet.
For you and your families, the war does not end when you come home. It endures in the wound that is slow to heal, the disability that isn't going away, the dream that wakes you up at night, the stiffening in your spine when a car backfires down the street. You and your families have done your duty. Now, a grateful nation must do ours. That is why I've committed to expanding our system of veterans health care to serve more patients and to provide better care in more places.
Crowd goes wild. That was the start of the end of the war. This is a big deal today. And whatever you think about this plan to end the war, there was one thing in this speech today that struck me, it didn't strike me as necessarily wrong, but it struck me as not the way I remember it. Here it is.
I want to be very clear. We sent our troops to Iraq to do away with Saddam Hussein's regime, and you got the job done.
Nobody's going to argue that that job was not done, but I am a little nudgy about the idea that the mission we tasked our military with in the first place was dumping Saddam Hussein. It's just not how I remember it from the time. Do you want to know how I remember it?
We will consult. But let there be no misunderstanding. If Saddam Hussein does not fully disarm, for the safety of our people and for the peace of the world, we will lead a coalition to disarm him.
Yeah, weren't we supposed to be disarming him? Wasn't that the justification, or at least the pretense for the war? That clip was from Bush's State of the Union in January 2003. Then 6 weeks later, he gave his "Here we come" speech.
We have sent hundreds of weapons inspectors to oversee the disarmament of Iraq. The United States and our allies are authorized to use force in ridding Iraq of weapons of mass destruction.
Ridding Iraq of weapons of mass destruction. That was the whole idea, right? That's why we went. I am reluctant to let that fact disappear down the memory hole. Because if, as the war ends, or at least starts to end, if at this time the history of the war is written as us going there to topple the regime of a bad man, when that frankly isn't why we were told that we were going there, then aren't we still at risk of making this horrific mistake again? And aren't we letting the people who foisted the WMD idea on us that many years ago, aren't we sort of letting them get away with it? Joining us now is Charles Delfer. He led the CIA's weapons inspection team in Iraq after the war started. He's also the author of the new book, Hide and Seek, The Search for Truth in Iraq. Mr. Delfer, thank you so much for being on the show tonight.
Thank you for inviting me.
The pre-war intelligence on Iraq's weapons of mass destruction turned out to be wrong. The big question is, are the systemic problems that made that error possible now fixed?
I think the intelligence community has taken a lot of steps to make sure that we don't make that magnitude of mistake again. What happened was there was just a predisposition to assume that Saddam had WMD. Here's a guy who had the experience in the 1980s in his war with Iran of using weapons of mass destruction. He used 101,000 chemical rounds. That saved his regime in the 1980s. Subsequently, as you mentioned in the first Gulf War by the Elder, Saddam believed that his possession of WMD at that time deterred the Americans from going to Baghdad then. So there was a predisposition to believe that Iraq would have weapons of mass destruction, so we tended in the intelligence community to see all evidence to fit that hypothesis, which turned out to be wrong. Now the guidance is you should always have competing hypotheses. And that's true for every American citizen as well, I would point out. I mean, in a way, we're all intelligence analysts.
In terms of the political inclinations to believe that Saddam had weapons of mass destruction and that that would be a good reason to justify invading Iraq, that would be justification enough, do you think that the intelligence community is oriented in a sufficiently different way right now that if we had some sort of political inclination like that in the future, it wouldn't be enabled by the intel?
I think what you're saying is correct. The intelligence community, was not the tool of the politicians to the extent that I think many Americans suspect. Where we got tied up in knots around WMD was because the method for containing Saddam throughout the 1990s were sanctions. Sanctions were held around Saddam by the UN Security Council, and the rule was that Iraq would have sanctions, would be under sanctions, so long as it did not comply with the disarmament provisions. When President Bush came in, the sanctions were crumbling. He had a problem of what am I going to do with Saddam? He was advised by the State Department and indeed the British to say, well, behave as an internationalist and go through the UN. And the view was that there's no way that Saddam could comply with the WMD provisions, so that Bush would get what I think he ultimately wanted was a rationale for getting rid of Saddam. But that made the issue pivot on WMD. They sold it to the American people largely on WMD, and you remember quite well the statements about the next, we don't want the smoking gun to be a mushroom cloud. All of that turned out completely wrong. But that was not the biggest intelligence mistake by the regime, the Bush presidency. The biggest mistake, I think, was their ignorance about the internal dynamics of Iraq. They elected to move Saddam out without any firm understanding of what was going to follow him. And that was the costliest mistake. That cost us over 4 years, billions and billions of dollars, thousands and thousands of lives.